last week we shared the story in our series on the stories of God and the stories of us. Last week was the story of the baby Moses. Moses, again, had no part. He just laid there, right? He floated down the river and all those good things. And our story this week picks up a little bit later in Moses' life after he has grown up. If you remember, at the end of our story last week, Moses was being tended to, nursed by his mother through some finagling by his sister and all these things that happened. He's being nursed by his mother, and he's returned to Pharaoh's daughter, where he grows up in the court of Pharaoh. And our story this week picks up after he is grown. Now, some things happen between these two stories that are kind of important for us to remember. First, Moses goes out one day. And apparently he has lived with mom long enough where he understands where he came from, who he is, who his people are. So he's out there walking around and he sees an Egyptian beating the tar out of a Hebrew. He doesn't like that very much. So he looks around, makes sure nobody's looking, and goes and kills the Egyptian and buries him in the sand. And a little while later, he encounters a couple of Hebrews who are duking it out. And rather than kill one of them, he talks to them, talks them off the edge. They kind of de-escalate a little bit, but then one of them says, "Who are you? Who made you judge? After all, aren't you the one who killed that Egyptian?" Moses kind of freaks out. Well, if they know, everybody knows. And if everybody knows, Pharaoh knows. And I'm in deep, deep trouble. So Moses hightails it out of town. He boogies across the continent. If you look at a map of the ancient Near East, Egypt's way over here and Midian is way over here. He goes off to Midian. And there he does what all the Old Testament characters do. He meets somebody at a well, ends up finding his wife, Zipporah, and they end up having a child, Gershom. And Moses becomes a shepherd. From Pharaoh's court to a lowly shepherd. Now, our story to this point has focused on Moses and what's happening in Moses' life. And if these writers of this ancient text had used the word meanwhile, you ever watch a movie and they go, meanwhile, and they switch scenes and it's somewhere else? That's kind of what the text is doing here. Now, this is the narrator speaking. And I told First Service that I tried to negotiate with Mac's agent to get him to read this line as well, but there was no go, so I have to read this line for Mac. This is immediately before the story as we are about to hear it. After a long time, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned under their slavery and cried out. Out of the slavery, their cry for help rose up to God. God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God looked upon the Israelites. God took notice of them.
Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. He led his flock beyond the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of a bush. He looked, and the bush was blazing, yet it was not consumed. Then Moses said,
I must turn aside and look at this great sight and see why the bush is not burned up.
When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush.
Moses, Moses.
Here I am.
Come no closer. Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob.
And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God.
I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. Indeed, I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them from the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the country of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. The cry of the Israelites has now come to me. And I have also seen the Egyptians oppress them. So come, I will send you to Pharaoh to bring to my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt.
Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?
I will be with you, and this shall be the sign for you that it is I who sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall worship God on this mountain.
If I come to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your ancestors has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What shall I say to them?
I am who I am. Thus you shall say to the Israelites, I am has sent me to you. Thus you shall say to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and this my title for all generations.
You know what? Adulting is hard. It is hard. One of the things about adulting that I like the very least, hate may not be too strong of a word for it. One of the things that I dislike about adulting is an interview for a job. Has anybody ever been on an interview for a job? Yes. Has anybody ever enjoyed an interview for a job? No. They are important, though. It's important for the employer to get to know the potential employee a little bit to make sure that that employee will be a good fit for the work that is to be done. And it's also an opportunity for that potential employee to get to know the employer, to know whether or not they are a good fit to work for them, right? So it's really important, but still, I just hate it. You got all these questions like, what's your weak point? I have none. I'm trying to impress you. I'm trying to get this job, and you want me to talk about where I'm weak? I want to talk about where I am strong. Where do you want to be in 5 years? I actually had that question in an interview a long time ago, and it was in the early 80s. And the job market was kind of tight, and I was really tired of the interview process. I can't remember how many places I had interviewed before this. And the guy asked me that question. His name was Jimmy Day. Where do you want to be in 5 years? And I said, I want your job. It worked. It was amazing. It worked. He, for whatever reason, took me under his wing and began to teach me bakery maintenance engineering and management, and yeah, that was amazing. But other than that, I hate interviews. And if you're like me, when you hear this story, having heard it many times through our lives, in fact, it's kind of a catchphrase, I had a burning bush experience. That's all you think about is this burning bush. And God calling Moses, and Moses goes, great, let's go. There's so much depth to this whole story. In fact, this whole story is basically a job interview. But it's not Moses being interviewed for a job by God. It is more that Moses is interviewing God. The first words, or the first question out of Moses' mouth is, who am I? What makes you think that I am qualified to do this thing that you're talking about that you want me to do? You want me to go up against the leader of the largest empire that is known in the world and tell them, hey, me and my buds want to leave. Let us go. You want me to do this? Who am I that you would ask that I do this? And God says, don't worry about it. I'll be with you. We got this. The very next question is very telling. Okay, so say I go back to my people and I say that you have called me to do this. And they ask me, well, what is your name? What am I to tell them? Because Moses knows who it is that he is speaking to. He knows that this God, this is Yahweh, the God of the fathers, the God of Abraham and Isaac and Joseph. He knows all this. But he wants to know, what is God's name? There's a lot of power in a name. If someone says Melissa to me, I know where the power lies. It's right here with Melissa. If someone says Vladimir Putin to anybody in this room, we know the power that is behind that name. If somebody drops that name, you know that nefarious things are going to follow, but you know that there is power behind that name. So Moses wants to know, what is the power behind your name, Yahweh? Because I know that you are the God of my ancestors. I know that you are the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. I know all that. I know that you brought that family, all 70 of them, out of a famine into Egypt, and you got them set up all nice and pretty. I know all of that. But are you really up for this task? Do you really have the power to have my back when I go up before the Pharaoh? Really? What's your name? What is your name? Because it's one thing to take a family of 70 people and move them into an empire and get them set up all nice and pretty. But look what's happened to us since then. 430 years. Where have you been? Our people are enslaved. They're horribly oppressed. They are being used as slave labor to better the empire. Where have you been? In fact, where were you through most of the story of the ancestors? Where were you? Yeah, you were present. You were up front with Abraham, a little bit with Isaac, but then after that, it's like you disappeared. You showed up to wrestle once with Jacob, but where have you been since then? You're calling me to go up before Pharaoh. Who are you? And God's response is one of those unfortunate incidences in translation from Hebrew to English, because our English language does not capture the depth of what God's response is. In Hebrew, it is Heya Asher Heya. And a better translation than I am who I am would be, I will be who I will be. I will be what I will be. So God tells Moses, go back and tell them that Yahweh, who will be who he will be, is your God and has sent you. So Moses is interviewing God. But he's not done yet. So what if they don't believe me? What if they don't believe that I even saw you out here on this mountain, this place that I wandered off to as I was tending to my sheep, this mountain called Horeb, the mountain of God? What if they don't believe that I even encountered you here? God said, what is that in your hand? Moses said, it's a staff. So throw it on the ground. So he does, and it turns into a snake. God says, pick it up by its tail. He grabs it by its tail. It turns back into a staff. Nice little parlor trick. And God says, put your hand in your robe. And Moses puts his hand in his robe, and he pulls it out, and it's all leprous, withered, as if he had leprosy. And God said, put your hand back in your robe. He does. He pulls it back out again. It is healed. And he tells Moses, okay, if that doesn't work, go grab some water out of the Nile River, that river of life. Take it and throw it on the ground before them, and it will become blood, symbolic of death. Then they will believe you. Moses is becoming more convinced that perhaps this Yahweh, this God of my ancestors, might be powerful enough to have my back when I go up against Pharaoh. Just maybe. Then he asks again, but me? I can't even speak very well. I said, don't worry about it. If it doesn't work out, you can go preach in Weatherford, Texas. By this time, God's getting a little irritated at all of Moses' questions. And God says, who do you think puts the words in the mouths of the mute? Who do you think does all of these things? I am, and I said, I will be with you. I will put the words in your mouth. And what about your brother Aaron? He speaks quite well. I will put words in his mouth as well. We are in this together. We can do this. So Moses finally agrees. We know the rest of the story. At least if we've watched the movie, we know the rest of the story, all the 10 plagues and all that stuff, Charlton Heston. Yeah, we've seen that movie. But throughout the rest of the relationship between Moses and God, there's a lot of drama, a lot of trauma, a lot of back and forth, a lot of bargaining. Come on, God, don't kill them all yet. We're almost there. Or take them away, God. I'm really tired of dealing with this people, but together they worked through it, and they delivered those people to the promised land. But before they could embark, Moses had to know, what is your name? Who are you? Now, we've been talking about story. And we've been talking about how interesting it is to look back and see how people wrote down what they understood about God and God's activity in the human world, God's activity in creation, how they understood that God was present in creation. And they wrote down all these stories, and they're fascinating stories, yes. But more importantly, these stories can inform us about who we are. They can inform us about who God is. They can inform us about who we are with God and in God's eyes. So the question on the table is, does God have our back? Is God powerful enough? When God places it on your heart, when you see that child who is hungry and homeless, and God places that on your heart and calls you to go and minister to that child, go get that child some relief, do you know that God has your back, that God has the power to stand behind you in this? Or do you have questions? You've done an interview with God. Because after all, we don't hear from God, do we? Has anybody heard a booming voice? Has anybody actually seen a bush burning that is not consumed? Has anybody heard that voice of God coming from anywhere? Or are we in a place and a time just like those people that were languishing in Egypt, wondering how long? How long, oh God, before you hear our cries? How long before you hear our cries? So if that burning bush, if that calling from God for you to go and address the atrocities that are happening at our southern border, and you think, I am just one guy, I'm just one girl, what in the world could I possibly do? I know, God, you're calling me to react and respond to this situation, but who am I? Yeah, you say you have my back, but who are you? Can I trust you? Can I know that you will be with me in that? In this story of Moses' encounter with God on this Mount Horeb, this mountain of God, in this story that's laid out before us, we see this conversation that says it's okay. It's okay to wonder. It's okay to say, okay, God, you're telling me to go do this. Do you have my back in this? Really? Do you really have my back in this? It's okay. God is calling us to do things that are extraordinary, God is calling us to do things that we do not believe we can actually do, but God is also telling us that I am with you in this. I will not leave you as you go about the work that I am calling you to do. I am with you. And we know more of the story than Moses even knew, because we are a post-resurrection people. And we know the story of Jesus Christ. We know the story of the Christ who put on flesh and walked with us and talked with us and laughed and cried with us and died for us. We know that story, that God was present in the flesh with us and God remains present in the Spirit with us. We know all of this to be true, and yet we can still go, but do you really have my back? And the short answer is yes. So as we look around the world and see all the bushes that are on fire, we can have the confidence that Moses finally arrived at when he said yes to God and went to Pharaoh. Amen? Let us pray.